Hello, gentlemen, and welcome to another Palo View Market Research video. Today, myself and many other people much smarter than me continue to scream from the mountaintops that humanity does not know how to measure inflation. This is an age-old problem. So in today's video, I'm going to be doing my best to build on top of Eric Weinstein's ideas on this topic. I've had several discussions with Eric Weinstein now, once in person pictured here, and a couple of times on his Instagram Live during COVID. Back when I met him in person, he sent me down a rabbit hole, encouraging me to go read physics papers from the late 1920s so I could improve my ability to think in first principles. I did that, and I would pass on that recommendation to you as well. But let's get into the meat of this because this video is dense, and we have absolutely no time to waste. Now, Weinstein is quoted stating on multiple podcasts now that modern, academically trained economists do not know how to measure inflation. Why? Well, to understand what he means, we first need to identify where biases lie regarding how economists measure inflation today. But before we get into that, let's first define what the Federal Reserve's job is, as the Federal Reserve is ultimately the one in charge of determining how inflation is measured. If you're unaware, the Federal Reserve is mandated by Congress to perform two very specific functions. The first is to maximize employment, and the second is to maintain price stability. Makes sense? But there is a hidden mandate that the Fed has clearly developed internally that is undermining their ability to fulfill their other mandates as optimally as maybe they could otherwise. Their biases, which I'm about to get into detail here in a second, can be summed up as follows. Do not allow people to form different tastes from each other or from themselves yesterday. This is the case not because they want it to be, but because they lack the mathematical skills to account for those variances. So let's break down why and how that is the case in detail so you can understand where the Fed and modern economists at large are failing to measure inflation accurately today. For further context, inflation measures today primarily base their calculations on data sourced from the Consumer Price Index, commonly known as the CPI. The CPI uses a fixed basket of goods and services. However, consumers often change their purchasing habits in response to price changes, substituting cheaper alternatives for more expensive ones. By not fully accounting for this substitution effect, inflation calculations can be misleading, as the index doesn't reflect the actual spending behavior of consumers. Economists today also adjust prices to account for changes in product quality, such as technological improvements in electronics. But these adjustments are often too subjective and can lead to an overemphasis on the quality improvements themselves. This often leads to an understating inflation when the perceived value enhancements are not aligned with a consumer's experience. This has become especially problematic over the past 15 years or so. Not to mention, core inflation estimates often exclude volatile items like food and energy prices in an attempt to provide a more stable view on long-term inflation trends. This exclusion makes inflation appear lower than what consumers actually experience, especially during periods of significant price changes. Housing costs in the CPI are measured using owner equivalent rent, which estimates what homeowners would pay if they were renting their homes. This method is highly problematic for obvious reasons, as it fails to accurately measure the actual cost of maintaining one's home. Inflation measures also tend to use urban areas for data collection, which neglects rural pricing differences. Rapid technological advancements can also make it challenging to compare prices over time, as products may offer vastly different features. But even more importantly, the weights assigned to these different goods and services in the inflation basket are based on average consumption patterns, which absolutely change over time. And the Fed has been caught endless times now adjusting those weights to fit what policymakers in a given administration seek to portray versus seeking accuracy. Also, when these weights are not updated regularly and in the correct direction, inflation estimates can totally fail to accurately represent current consumer spending habits. The CPI often excludes changes to asset prices, such as real estate, stocks, and bonds. This exclusion means that rising prices in housing markets or stock markets are not reflected in inflation statistics, even though they obviously affect consumers' wealth and purchasing power. This also makes it more difficult to understand the difference between asset appreciation and inflation. Even more importantly, inflation measures often use average spending patterns, not median spending patterns. This then fails to reflect the consumption differences between groups at different levels of income, as lower income households spend a larger proportion of their income on necessities. So they are more negatively affected by higher inflation, and that is not considered competently using modern calculation methods. Also, there are often delays between when price changes occur and when they are reflected in inflation statistics. This lag can result in policymakers making decisions based on outdated inflation information. Lastly, government subsidies, price controls, and interventions distort prices, but are almost never considered in inflation calculations, especially when subsidy programs change over time. But none of this includes other problems, such as how tax brackets often fail to index with inflation, meaning taxpayers are often pushed into higher tax brackets due to increases in nominal income rather than increases in terms of real purchasing power gains. AKA, in the eyes of the government, your income goes up, but in reality, your purchasing power in the economy doesn't change. So inflation can actually lead to an increased tax burden and less purchasing power simultaneously. So, since we identify the problems, how do we begin to solve them? Well, according to Weinstein, the solution lies through the utilization of gauge theory. This is a framework from physics that describes how fields interact under certain symmetries. And through parallel translation and local gauge variances, we can unlock the ability to compare quantities that were once considered incomparable, helping us to construct new methods for measuring inflation that remain sufficiently robust against the various distortions they inevitably face. So the first step is to identify the fields. In gauge theory, fields represent quantities that vary over space and time. In the context of inflation measurement, we can easily identify three fields: price fields, consumption fields, and quality fields, because we need to determine the prices of goods and services across different locations and times, the qualities of goods and services consumed, so we can optimally reflect consumer preferences and behaviors. And lastly, we need to measure the utility derived from these goods and services. So now that this foundation is set, how do we take the next step so we can begin to actually make these calculations? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing tomorrow. I'll see you guys then.